Do you remember sitting there in the last episode of Game of Thrones and asking yourself, what's going on and why is Tyrion talking about stories right now? Because I do, and I think I've finally figured out what exactly they were trying to do with all of this talk about stories and the message they were trying to get across. They managed to remove enough of the other themes and enough of the magical elements of the story that they couldn't effectively get the message across, but by the end of this video, I'll explain those missing elements, and you'll finally understand what exactly Tyrion was going on about. So the answer to this question actually ties back to some of the things I've been talking about through a big series on my channel, which will be linked at the end of this video if you haven't seen it. But basically, the idea is that the culture of the old ways and the entire worship of the weirwoods is essentially a giant system that runs society and unites people around the worship of the weirwoods, all because of the fear of the others. I have also talked in recent videos about how feudalism was adopted by essentially everyone had all of their stuff stolen by bandits for long enough where they decided, hey, what if we all just banded together and gave like 20-30% of our crops to some guy who could protect us, rather than having 100% of it stolen by bandits? So essentially, feudalism united people under fear, and delivery from that fear, thanks to swearing fealty to a feudal lord, was one of the big things that kept people in line during feudalism. Essentially, every other lord sitting around pointing their spears at each other and each other's small folk was a system that used fear to control everybody. And in Westeros, we see an advanced magical feudal system that's held in place for thousands of years longer than even normal feudalism did, all with the same families ruling. And why is that? Well, because there must always be a Stark in Winterfell, otherwise the others are going to come back in some ambiguous way, right? That seems to be the legend. It is the Starks who can protect us from the others, and it is the fear of the others that keeps everyone loyal to the Starks, loyal to their lords, allowing things like the First Night, allowing things like blood sacrifice to the weirwoods. I've speculated with a lot of evidence presented in videos you can go watch after this, that essentially this whole system is set up as a blood sacrifice system, all to power the weirwood magic, and therefore keep the others away. So much like feudalism, it's a magically backed version of that, all united with fear as the main motivator. Fear of the others. One of the things that our characters are going to be working towards is a rebirth and a loss of the old ways, a cycling into new ways, and the rebirth of these new ways is going to hopefully be a healthier way for the world to run. That's the idea. So, if you are getting rid of the others, if you are defeating this fear, literally like defeating fear, and getting society past that system of control, well, you need something to unite people besides fear of the others, right? It represents, like on a growth and humanity level, the abandonment of tribalism and the uniting behind shared humanity. Shared stories and common humanity being the thing that can replace fear of each other and fear of the others as a uniting force in society, a healthier way to unite people. So the magical elements and themes that they seem to have removed in Season 8 is essentially the idea of the world tree going through a cycle of rebirth, which we've talked about, as well as going into the detail of explaining what exactly is going on with the whole consciousness merge that's going on inside the weirwoods. And as far as I can tell, the most likely answer to that is that it's essentially just that, a big consciousness merge of all of the people who have ever lived, going into essentially a big hive mind where they are stored inside these trees. Which, if this tree system is going through a cycle of rebirth and needs to be destroyed and reborn, it kinda does make sense then why Bran seemingly got the big download where he took that hive mind into his own body and was then carrying it around and was no longer Bran. He was the Three-Eyed Raven, which is essentially the show's version of trying to explain or give a name to the collective consciousness that was within the weirwoods. So if the weirwoods are going to be destroyed and reborn, it would kind of make sense for Bran to absorb that collective consciousness before then potentially putting it into the new world tree. I don't know. Maybe that'll happen in the books. We didn't really get anything like that in the show. But again, in the show, they removed the whole world tree cycle of rebirth that we think is going on. This cycle of rebirth seems to be hinted at from the very first line of the first book, which is we should start back, and then it mentions the woods growing darker around them, which if the woods are a representation of the world tree, which is a representation of society and magic on a grand level, and it's growing darker, that's all sort of hinting that, hey, we should start back at the beginning and sort of wipe the slate clean and start again. Try again with the way that we structure society and the way that we are doing things in the world. One of those big restructurings will come in the form of, rather than trying to unite people under fear of the others or fear of each other, they should unite under stories and shared humanity. So this is why Tyrion is calling Bran our memory and why he's talking about stories. It is, on some level at least, getting closer to explaining what the heck was going on in Season 8, which you can sort of see how the pieces came together when you realize that they just sort of took little bits of George's magic and his ending and tried to piece it together without actually explaining the core elements of it, probably because they thought a lot of this consciousness magic and world tree elements and hive minds and things like that, it would all be very difficult to explain in a television medium compared to in a book where you can be in the minds of the characters. So I think that might have something to do with why they abandoned it, but also then they were definitely putting little pieces of it still in there just without the context, and that's why it all came off as so weird, which I think on a lot of levels we all knew that Season 8 was just pieces of George's ending without the proper context, but hopefully this is a direct example of actually explaining and connecting some of those dots. The removal of the idea of the world tree and the weirwoods and the cycle of rebirth that they need to go through is the thing that explains why things like the Isle of Faces and Howland Reed were missing from Season 8. It sort of explains how all of the themes came up so flat and why they feel like all of them were missing something. It's because they weren't handled properly, and I could imagine some of the argument between George and D&D was going along the lines of this. We are not doing the big world tree thing, George. Nobody's gonna get it anyway. It's nerd stuff. It's hive mind shenanigans. We don't care. And George is going, it's the whole point. It's the entire thing. There's so much build-up to it, and it's all thematically made relevant by the cycle of rebirth and the whole themes. All of the themes are important. And they're going, no, themes are for 8th grade book reports. And then that's how we get Season 8. They were taking bits and pieces of what George gave them, but they didn't fully commit to the entire idea, and they didn't even quite understand what was actually important to it all in the end anyway. Understanding the changes that they made to Season 8, and how you can piece together and connect the dots the more you understand them, is one of the things that I feel like is so important to understanding what parts of the ending came from George, and what parts were made up to fill in the gaps of the things that D&D removed. And weirdly enough, that leads to some times where there's something that's just so out of place that it's just like, oh, clearly that was a note from George and they took out all the context, and they didn't really know what to do with it, but they also just didn't take it out. And I think Tyrion's little monologue about stories was a theme that they tried to stick in there on some level or another without all of the context being appropriately established, and then all of a sudden you can see what happens where it just doesn't work. The other thing that feels worth noting, in case you're really doubting the idea that this actually probably did come from George, is that right early on in Game of Thrones, in the first book, when he thought this was a trilogy and going to be much shorter, he was talking about how there are stories that are there that are older than Old Nan and older than Bran, and they'll be around long after them. And also, Bran got the direct lesson from his father about overcoming fear. These themes have been there from the beginning of Bran's story. And I'm very curious to hear what you all have to say about that down in the comments. Do you think it makes sense that the idea that the defeat of the others and the rebirth of the world tree that was removed from the television show on some level essentially represents a society getting past the idea of being controlled by fear and therefore needing a new control mechanism, a new binding agent to bring everyone together and to keep everyone working towards the same goals, and those goals should not be blood sacrifice to trees because you're scared of what others will do to you if you don't. They will be better goals that are more productive for humanity, and they will be centered around the idea of stories and shared traditions and shared common humanity. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you with something else very soon.